14 minutes, 22 seconds. That's how long Lashanda Smith had before everything she'd built would burn to the ground. 14 minutes and 22 seconds before the dead man's switch she'd coded into the Han Group's mainframe would detonate, sending 5 years of classified intelligence straight to the FBI, the SEC, and every major news outlet in North America. 5 days. That's how long she'd been walking around with 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that made the fluorescent lights feel like knives behind her eyes, and a hematoma on her thigh so deep it had turned the color of rotted plums. 5 days since Julian Vane had cornered her in the executive gym, all polished charm and entitlement, until the word no turned him into something feral. 5 days since his fists had taught her that power doesn't care about ethics degrees or corner offices or the fact that she'd just exposed his $400 million money laundering scheme. 5 days of binding her torso so tight she could barely breathe, of concealing bruises with turtlenecks in 70-degree weather, of swallowing ibuprofen by the handful just to stay conscious through conference calls. But Lashanda Smith didn't just survive those 5 days. She weaponized them. While Julian Vane walked the halls of the Han Group Tower in Chicago like a predator certain of his kill, Lashanda was building her insurance policy. Every labored breath, every spike of agony when she bent to pick up her briefcase, every moment she thought she might pass out in the elevator, she used it. The dead man's switch wasn't just her protection. It was her revenge, ticking down like a heartbeat, waiting for her to either live or destroy everything. And now, standing in the glass-walled boardroom on the 48th floor, surrounded by men in tailored suits who'd spent 18 months watching Julian Vane harass her in meetings, who'd laughed at his jokes about her aggressive reporting style, who'd suggested she reconsider her tone when she'd presented evidence of fraud now, with the timer on her phone hidden in her blazer pocket counting down, Lashanda Smith was about to do something insane. She was going to tell the truth. Julian sat 3 seats down, his smile razor-sharp. He'd already won, or so he thought. He'd stolen her security badge, planted false transaction records under her digital signature, set her up to be disappeared by the very organization she'd spent 2 years trying to legitimize. In his mind, this meeting would end with her in handcuffs or worse. But Julian Vane didn't know about the switch. He didn't know that Lashanda had spent the last 5 days making sure that if she went down, the entire Han Empire would follow. At the head of the table sat Han So-jin, 39 years old, CEO of the Han Group's legitimate holdings, and the quiet, calculating uncle of the most powerful Korean syndicate on the Midwest corridor. He looked like he belonged in a Swiss boardroom charcoal suit, dark eyes that gave away nothing, the kind of stillness that made even aggressive men hesitate. But everyone in Chicago's underworld knew the truth. Seo-jin wasn't just a CEO. He was the dragon who'd unified 3 warring factions, who'd turned street-level gang violence into billion-dollar infrastructure deals, whose enemies didn't just disappear, they were erased from memory. And for 18 months, he'd been watching Lashanda, not the way Julian watched her like prey. Seo-jin watched her the way a general studies a weapon he doesn't yet know how to use. Every audit she completed that saved his legitimate operations from federal scrutiny, every loophole she closed that prevented his syndicate from exposure, every time she stood in a boardroom full of men twice her age and made them listen, he'd seen her. But he'd never spoken to her directly, not once. Lashanda pulled the clicker from her portfolio with fingers that barely trembled. She could feel her ribs grinding with every breath. The room tilted slightly, but she locked her knees and forced herself steady. "Gentlemen," her voice cut through the low hum of conversation, clear and controlled. "I'm here to present the findings of the Q3 compliance review." Julian's smile widened. Seo-jin's expression didn't change at all. She clicked to the first slide, a financial flowchart so dense with false transactions it looked like a spider web. Over the past 8 months, someone has been using Han Group subsidiary accounts to launder funds through offshore shell companies. The total amount exceeds $400 million. The room went silent. Julian leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed. Lashanda clicked to the next slide. Transaction records, bank routing numbers, digital signatures. Her vision started to blur at the edges. The countdown on her phone read, 11 minutes, 47 seconds. The evidence points to, the pain was white-hot and absolute. Her cracked ribs, which she'd been holding together through sheer will and compression bandaging, shifted. It felt like something inside her chest had splintered further, like shrapnel tearing through muscle. Her nervous system shut down before she could even process what was happening. The clicker hit the floor first, then her knees buckled. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. Her body simply stopped obeying her, and Lashanda Smith, the woman who'd survived an assault and coded a digital bomb while concussed, began to fall. But she didn't hit the ground. Because Han Seo-jin moved. He was out of his chair and across the room before Julian Vane had even registered what was happening, before the rest of the board could draw breath. His hands caught her, one behind her shoulders, one beneath her knees, and he lifted her with the kind of strength that made the entire room freeze. Up close, Lashanda could see the exact moment Seo-jin's carefully controlled expression cracked. His eyes, which everyone said were impossible to read, were blazing with something that looked like fury and fear in equal measure. He looked down at her face, at the sheen of cold sweat on her brown skin, at the way her lips had gone pale, at the bruise peeking out from beneath her collar that she hadn't managed to cover. "Get the car." Seo-jin's voice was quiet, but every man in that room moved like he'd shouted. "Now." He looked at Julian Vane, still sitting, still smiling. "And get him out of my sight before I forget we're in a public building." The last thing Lashanda saw before her vision went black was Seo-jin's face, and the realization crystallizing there that someone in his organization had broken the only person who'd been protecting them all. Before you find out what happens when a mafia boss realizes his queen has been bleeding in silence, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story is about power, protection, and the very thin line between salvation and possession. You won't want to miss what comes next. The Han Group wasn't Chicago's biggest corporation. That honor belonged to the old money giants with their names on museums and hospital wings. But it was the most feared. On paper, it was a legitimate international conglomerate: real estate development, logistics, private security contracting, the kind of portfolio that looked impressive in annual reports and shareholder meetings. But everyone who mattered in Chicago knew the real story. The Han Group was the civilized face of the Han Syndicate, an organization that controlled everything from the docks to the underground gambling networks, that settled disputes with efficiency rather than violence, that had turned Korean organized crime from scattered street gangs into a vertically integrated empire. And Lashanda Smith, 30 years old, director of global risk compliance, had spent 2 years trying to make sure the legitimate side stayed clean enough to survive federal investigation. She was a black woman in a corporate culture that barely tolerated her presence, armed with degrees from Northwestern and a mind that could trace money through digital mazes that would make forensic accountants weep. She stood 5'7" in the sensible heels she wore to board meetings. With deep brown skin she'd stopped trying to make approachable years ago. Natural hair she wore in elegant twists, because code switching was exhausting, and dark eyes that had learned to hide everything. She was brilliant. She was isolated. And she was the only person in the building who dared to tell Han Seo-jin the truth about his organization's vulnerabilities. Which was probably why Julian Vane had decided she needed to disappear. The first thing Lashanda registered when consciousness returned was silence. Not the oppressive quiet of an empty room, but the deliberate absence of sound that came from expensive architecture and controlled environments. The second thing was the pain, a dull, throbbing symphony that radiated from her ribs with every shallow breath. The third thing was the smell. Antiseptic and something else. Leather, wood polish, money. Her eyes opened to a ceiling she didn't recognize. Recessed lighting, cream-colored panels, the kind of understated elegance that cost more to achieve than Flash ever could. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The compression around her torso was different now, professional medical wrapping instead of her desperate bathroom attempts. Panic hit her like ice water. The phone. Her hand flew to where her blazer pocket should have been, but she was wearing something else now. A soft cotton shirt, loose pants. Someone had changed her clothes. Someone had touched her while she was unconscious. Her heart hammered against her damaged ribs as she scanned the room with mounting dread. The medical suite, because that's clearly what this looked like. It belonged in a private hospital for people who didn't want questions asked. Cream walls, sleek monitoring equipment on silent standby, an IV stand beside the bed, though nothing was connected to her arm. No windows, one door, and in the corner, barely visible in the low light, a figure sat motionless in a leather chair. Han Seo-jin. He'd removed his suit jacket. His white shirt was rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. He sat with perfect stillness, legs crossed, hands resting on the chair arms, and in his right hand, catching the dim light like an accusation, was her phone. "You're awake." His voice was quiet, conversational even, but there was something underneath it that made her throat go dry. Lashanda forced herself to meet his eyes. Up close, without the buffer of a boardroom table between them, Han Seo-jin was different than she'd imagined during those 18 months of careful distance. His face was all sharp angles and brutal elegance, high cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from stone, lips pressed into a line that gave away nothing. But his eyes, God, his eyes were what legends were made of. Dark and fathomless, the kind of gaze that had watched men beg and hadn't blinked. Right now, those eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like physical weight. "My phone," she said, and hated how her voice cracked. "Yes." He held it up slightly. "It's been counting down for the past 6 hours. Very sophisticated work. Military-grade encryption on the timer mechanism. Multiple redundancy protocols. I'm impressed." Her blood went cold. "What time? What does it say?" "It says 0, Miss Smith." He tilted his head, studying her reaction. "It reached 0 approximately 4 hours ago." The world tilted. If the timer hit 0, the files would have uploaded. The FBI would have everything. The SEC would freeze every account. The entire Han group would be. "But you'll notice," Sojin continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle, "that nothing happened." He stood, and Lashanda's body tensed involuntarily. He moved like water, smooth and deliberate, crossing the small distance between them until he stood at the side of the medical bed. Up close, she could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. He'd been sitting in that chair, watching her, for hours. "The moment I saw that countdown in your pocket as I carried you out," he said, "I made a decision. We have a very specialized security system in this facility. Signal jammers designed to block everything from cell towers to satellite uplinks. The kind of equipment governments pretend doesn't exist in civilian hands." He set the phone on the table beside her bed, just out of reach. "Your switch triggered. The signal tried to send, but it went nowhere. It's been screaming into the void for 4 hours, Miss Smith, and no one heard a thing." The relief was so overwhelming it almost made her dizzy. But it was immediately replaced by a different kind of fear. Because if Sojin had blocked the signal, if he'd trapped her information inside the phone instead of letting it detonate. So now we come to the interesting part. Seojin leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his posture deceptively casual. But Lashanda could see the coiled readiness in him, the predator barely restrained. "You brought a digital bomb into my organization. You coded a weapon that could destroy everything I've built. And then you stood in my boardroom and tried to expose Julian Vane, who, for all his many faults, is the son of a board member and has never once threatened the structural integrity of this company." He moved closer, and Lashanda's breath caught despite herself. He braced one hand on the bed rail, leaning down until his face was level with hers. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the absolute control it was taking him not to do something violent. "So I'll ask you once, Miss Smith, and I suggest you answer truthfully." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, intimate and terrifying. "Who are you really working for?" Lashanda stared at him. At this man who'd caught her when she fell, who'd carried her to safety, who was now looking at her like she might be the most dangerous thing in his world. And then, against every instinct for self-preservation, against the pain screaming through her body, she started to laugh. It hurt. God, it hurt. Each breath was agony, but she couldn't stop. The absurdity of it all, 5 days of holding herself together, of building her perfect revenge, only to have it blocked by the man she'd been trying to protect. "I'm not," she gasped between painful breaths, "working against you, you paranoid bastard." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'm trying to save your empire," she said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "From Julian, from the feds, from your own damn board members who think money laundering through subsidiary accounts is acceptable risk." She met his gaze, unflinching despite the fear thrumming through her veins. "The passcode is 040718. Check the hidden folder. There's a document labeled insurance policy. But here's the thing. Seojin." She used his first name deliberately, watching him react to the familiarity. "The jammer only works while I'm here. In this room. If you kill me, if I leave this building, if anything happens to me, the signal goes out. So before you decide I'm your enemy, maybe you should check what I've actually been doing." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Then Sojin straightened, took the phone, and began typing. The blue glow of the screen illuminated his face as he scrolled, and Lashanda watched as his expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something that looked almost like shock. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the exact moment he understood. The bruises she hadn't quite hidden, the way she'd stood in that boardroom, barely able to breathe, to expose a man who'd already beaten her once. The 5 days she'd spent building a weapon, not against Seo-jin, but for him. Julian did this to you. It wasn't a question, but Lashanda answered anyway. When I told him I was taking the evidence to the board, he thought he could silence me before the meeting. She smiled, and it was all teeth. He was wrong. Seo-jin set the phone down carefully. His hands were shaking, and Lashanda realized with a jolt that Han Seo-jin, the Dragon of Chicago, the man who controlled an empire, was absolutely furious. Now, as consciousness flickered in and out, as she felt herself being carried through corridors that smelled like leather and coffee, as voices shouted in Korean and English both, Lashanda's last coherent thought was of the timer. 8 minutes, 33 seconds. She'd never given anyone the code. If she died, so did the Han group. And somehow, that felt exactly right. The phone screen cast harsh shadows across Seo-jin's face as he scrolled through the hidden folder. Lashanda watched his jaw tighten with each swipe, watched his breathing change from controlled to barely restrained. He was seeing it all, the transaction records she'd painstakingly traced, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the digital paper trail that led straight to Julian Vane's systematic gutting of Han Group subsidiaries. But it wasn't the financial evidence that made him stop breathing. It was the photographs. Lashanda had documented everything the night Julian attacked her. Through the haze of concussion and the agony of broken ribs, she dragged herself home and methodically photographed every bruise, every laceration, every piece of evidence that would prove what he'd done. Her torso was a canvas of violence, deep purple blooms across her ribs, black fingerprints on her shoulders where he'd held her down, the mottled darkness spreading across her thigh from where she'd hit the corner of the weight bench. She'd taken those photos in her bathroom mirror at 2 a.m, crying silently so her neighbors wouldn't hear, knowing she might need proof if she survived long enough to use it. Seo-jin stared at the screen for a full minute without moving. Then, with terrifying calm, he set the phone down on the medical tray and picked up the glass vase on the side table. Lashanda flinched as he hurled it across the room. It exploded against the far wall in a shower of crystal shards and water, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet space. But he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his own hands like they'd betrayed him. 18 months. His voice was barely audible, shaking with a fury so profound it made the air feel dense. For 18 months, you have been the only person in my organization I could trust with the truth. The only one who understood that legitimacy isn't weakness, it's survival. You saved this company from federal raids. You closed loopholes that would have brought down everything. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with broken ribs. And I let Julian Vane, a mediocre man with a stolen fortune and his father's protection, I let him walk the same halls as you. I let him breathe the same air. His hands curled into fists. I am the Dragon of Chicago. Men cross the street when they see my car. And yet you had to build a weapon to protect yourself because I didn't see what was happening under my own roof. You couldn't have known, Lashanda said quietly. I should have. He moved back toward the bed, his movements controlled again but no less intense. Get the doctor out. Her heart stuttered. What? I dismissed him hours ago. Seo-jin's gaze swept over her, clinical and assessing. But there was something else underneath it that made her skin feel too warm. I want to see the damage myself. That's not, you don't need to. I do. He was already reaching for the buttons of the shirt someone had dressed her in. Because I need to understand exactly what I allowed to happen. And because I don't trust anyone else in this building right now except you. His fingers were steady as they worked the first button free, but Lashanda could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid control he was exerting over himself. This wasn't desire, she told herself. This was something darker, something almost penitent. He was forcing himself to witness his own failure. The second button. The third. You can tell me to stop, he said, his voice lower now, intimate despite the clinical nature of what he was doing. But Lashanda found she didn't want him to stop, because for 5 days, she'd hidden this damage like shame. She'd contorted herself into turtlenecks and compression bandages, had taken burning showers where she couldn't look at her own body. Julian Vane had marked her and made her feel like it was something to conceal. She wanted Seo-jin to see it. Wanted him to understand the price she'd paid for protecting his empire. Don't stop, she whispered. He opened the shirt slowly, carefully, his knuckles barely grazing her skin. The medical wrapping covered her ribs, but everything else was exposed. The brutal geography of violence mapped across her brown skin in shades of purple and black and sickly yellow at the edges where older bruises were trying to heal. Seo-jin's breath left him in a rush. He knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to eye level with her torso, and Lashanda felt stripped bare in a way that had nothing to do with the open shirt. His gaze traced every mark with the focus of a man memorizing evidence for a trial. His hand came up, hesitated, then settled with devastating gentleness on her hip, where the hematoma bloomed darkest. His fingers trembled. "Did he break you?" The question was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. He tried. Lashanda's voice was stronger than she felt. He failed. Seojin's thumb moved in a small circle over the bruise, and the touch shouldn't have felt like this, like something electric and dangerous and wanted. But it did. Because this man, this dragon who made grown men fear his shadow, was touching her like she was made of glass and fury in equal measure. "I've built an empire," he said, his eyes still fixed on the damage, on the principle that violence is a tool, not a passion, that control is power, that fear is currency. Finally, he looked up at her face, and the rawness in his expression made something in her chest crack open. "But right now, Lashanda, I want to be the monster everyone thinks I am. I want to hurt him the way he hurt you. Are you going to finish what Julian started?" The question escaped before she could stop it. A test disguised as fear. Seojin's hand slid from her hip to her face, his palm cradling her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything he'd just said. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she could feel the leashed violence in him, the barely contained need to destroy something. "No," he said, and leaned closer until his lips were inches from her ear, until she could feel the heat of him, smell the subtle scent of his skin. Nothing artificial, just him. "I am going to burn the world for this, starting with his. You don't leave this suite until you are whole again. You don't walk those halls until you're ready. And Julian Vane?" His voice dropped to a whisper that felt like a brand against her skin. "Julian Vane doesn't leave his house. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever again." It was a promise and a threat and something else entirely. And Lashanda, who had spent 5 days building weapons out of pain, found herself believing him completely. 7 days. That's how long Lashanda had been living in Han So-jin's world, and she still couldn't decide if she was a guest or a prisoner. The penthouse suite occupied the entire top floor of a building she hadn't known existed in Chicago's financial district. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, art that probably belonged in museums, silence so complete it felt like being suspended in amber. Everything was cream and charcoal in cold perfection, except for Seo-jin. He was there every morning when she woke, sometimes at the desk in the corner, working on his laptop, sometimes in the chair by her bed, watching her with that unreadable expression. He brought her meals himself, changed her bandages with steady hands, spoke to her in that low voice about nothing and everything, like they were the only two people in the world. At night, she heard him on the phone in Korean, his voice sharp and commanding. The dragon conducting his empire from the shadows. And during the day, she watched him work. That's when Lashanda understood what she'd really gotten herself into. Seo-jin didn't shout, didn't threaten. He would sit at his desk, headphones in for video calls, and dismantle someone's entire existence with the calm efficiency of a surgeon. Except he wasn't saving lives, he was ending careers, rerouting money, making problems disappear with a few quiet sentences. She watched him negotiate a construction contract that she knew was money laundering for 3 different operations. Watched him advise a city councilman on infrastructure while simultaneously blackmailing him into compliance. Watched him run an empire built on fear and respect in equal measure. And God help her, it didn't scare her. It fascinated her, because she recognized it. The same ruthless intelligence she used to trace money through shell companies. The same ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. The same willingness to do what was necessary instead of what was easy. They were the same species of monster, just operating in different ecosystems. On the 7th day, her ribs hurt less. She could breathe without wanting to cry. The bruises had faded from black to purple to that sickly yellow-green that meant healing. She was getting stronger, which meant she was getting restless. Lashanda made it to the bathroom on her own that afternoon, determined to shower without assistance for the first time in a week. The suite's bathroom was obscene, all dark tile and rain shower heads and a tub that could fit 4 people. She managed to get the water running, managed to peel off the soft clothes Seo-jin had given her, managed to step under the spray, and then she tried to lift her arm to wash her hair. The pain was sharp and immediate, a reminder that cracked ribs didn't care about pride. She gasped, hand frozen halfway to her head, water streaming down her face. "Stubborn doesn't suit you." Lashanda's eyes snapped open. Seo-jin stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame like he'd been watching for a while. He was still dressed, black shirt rolled to his elbows, dark slacks, but there was something different about him, something less controlled. "I can manage," she said through gritted teeth. "You can't." He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward the shower. "And you shouldn't have to." Before she could protest, he stepped fully clothed into the spray. The water hit him immediately, plastering his shirt to his chest, darkening his hair. He reached for the shampoo bottle without breaking eye contact, and Lashonda found she couldn't breathe for reasons that had nothing to do with broken ribs. "Turn around," he said softly. She did. His hands in her hair were gentle, thorough, working the shampoo through her natural curls with a care that made her throat tight. The steam rose around them, turning the bathroom into something hazy and unreal. His fingertips massaged her scalp, and Lashonda let her eyes close, let herself feel the intimacy of being cared for, the warmth of the water, the solid presence of him behind her. "Why haven't you killed him yet?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Julian, it's been a week." Seo-jin's hands stilled for a moment, then continued their careful work. "Tilt your head back." She did, and he rinsed the shampoo out, his fingers sliding through her hair with the water. When he spoke again, his voice was close to her ear, intimate in the steam-filled space. "Death is too easy, too quick. Julian Vane spent months making you uncomfortable in your own workplace. He beat you bloody and left you to crawl home alone. He tried to frame you for his crimes." His hands moved to her shoulders, steadying her. "A bullet would give him maybe 3 seconds of fear. I want him to suffer the way you suffered, slowly, with full knowledge of what's coming." Lashonda turned to face him, water streaming between them. His shirt was completely soaked now, transparent, clinging to every line of muscle. His hair dripped water onto his face, and there was something almost vulnerable about seeing him like this, not the dragon, just a man standing in a shower because she needed help. "I'm waiting for you to tell me how to destroy him properly," Seo-jin continued, his dark eyes holding hers. "Because this isn't my revenge, Lashonda. It's yours. I'm just the weapon you get to aim." Something shifted in her chest. Not attraction, though that was there too, simmering constant beneath everything else. This was recognition, partnership, the understanding that she wasn't alone in this gilded cage, she was being forged into something more dangerous. "I need to get out of this shower," she said quietly. He nodded, turned off the water, and reached for the towel. When he wrapped it around her, his hands lingered on her shoulders, and Lashonda felt small and powerful at the same time. Small because he could break her so easily, powerful because she knew he never would. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her back to the bedroom, and set her down on the edge of the bed with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. "I don't want him dead, Jin." She looked up at him, this man who'd become her protector and potential partner in 7 short days. "I want him erased. I want him to lose everything that makes him feel superior. His money, his father's name, his freedom, his future. I want him to watch it all disappear and know it was me who took it." Seo-jin's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Now you're speaking my language." "I need my laptop," Lashonda said, and the words felt like a declaration of war. "Let me show you how a director of risk handles a threat." He studied her for a long moment, water still dripping from his hair onto his ruined shirt, and then he nodded once. "Consider it done." The leather chair was too big for her, which made Lashonda feel absurdly powerful sitting in it. Seo-jin's chair, the dragon's throne. She'd wrapped herself in one of his silk robes after the shower, charcoal gray, falling past her knees, smelling faintly of him. Her laptop sat open on the desk in front of her. 3 monitors curved around her in a semicircle, and for the first time in 8 days, she felt like herself again. No, that wasn't true. She felt like something more than herself, something sharper, more dangerous. Seo-jin stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the thin silk. He hadn't changed out of his soaked clothes yet. Water still dripped occasionally from his hair onto her shoulder, and every time it did, something low in her stomach tightened. "Show me," he said quietly. Lashonda's fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory taking over. She bypassed the Han Group's main security protocols she'd designed herself, and dove into the shadow architecture where Julian had hidden his embezzlement. The back door she'd planted 5 months ago, when she'd first suspected something was wrong, opened like a welcome mat. There, she pointed to a string of transactions flowing across the center screen. Julian's been liquidating, converting assets to cryptocurrency, routing them through mixers, trying to make them untraceable. Smart, Seo-jin murmured, leaning closer to study the screen. His hand came to rest on the back of her chair, and she could feel him breathing. Not smart enough. Lashanda pulled up another window, showing Julian's digital footprint in real time. He thinks he's covered his tracks, but I've been watching him for days. He's panicking, making mistakes, and tonight she tapped the screen where a pending transfer sat waiting. Tonight he's moving everything. $40 million into an offshore wallet. His escape fund. Can you block it? I could. Lashanda's smile was all teeth. But that would just delay him. He'd try again, find another route, and eventually he might succeed. She opened a third window, this one showing account numbers that made Seo-jin go very still behind her. Is that the Bratva accounts? Yes. Lashanda pulled up the evidence she'd compiled months ago, the connection she'd been saving for exactly this moment. Julian wasn't just stealing from the Han Group. He was skimming from joint ventures with the Russian syndicate. Small amounts at first they probably didn't even notice. But over 2 years, he's taken almost $6 million from them. Seo-jin's laugh was dark and appreciative, and they have no idea. Not yet. Lashanda's hands hovered over the keyboard. But they're about to. She could feel Seo-jin's attention sharpening, could sense the predator in him leaning forward. What are you planning? I'm not going to block Julian's transfer, she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. I'm going to redirect it. All $40 million. Straight into the Bratva accounts he's been stealing from. The silence that followed was profound. Then Seo-jin's hand moved from the chair to her shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone through the silk. You're going to make it look like he's trying to buy his way out of what he stole. Better. Lashanda pulled up the message template she'd already drafted. I'm going to make it look like he's taunting them. A wire transfer with a memo line that says, with interest. Don't come looking for me. She felt more than heard Seo-jin's sharp intake of breath. His other hand came to rest on her other shoulder, and suddenly he was bracketing her in, his presence overwhelming and intoxicating. Lashanda. His voice was rough, impressed, maybe a little awed. The Russians will hunt him to the ends of the earth for that kind of disrespect. I know. She tilted her head back to look at him, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Pride, desire, recognition of a kindred spirit. Death was too easy, you said. This is better. Julian loses everything, his money, his freedom, his safety, and he'll spend whatever time he has left knowing that I did this. That the woman he tried to break is the one who destroyed him. Seo-jin's hand slid from her shoulder to her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. You are the most dangerous person I've ever met. I learned from the best, she whispered. For a moment, they stayed like that, her, sitting in his chair wearing his robe, him leaning over her, their faces inches apart. The air between them felt electric, charged with more than just the thrill of revenge. Then Lashanda turned back to the screen. Her finger hovered over the enter key. Last chance to stop me, she said. Seo-jin leaned down, his lips brushing against her neck just below her ear, and the touch sent fire racing through her veins. Do it. She pressed enter. The transfer executed immediately. $40 million moved through cyberspace in the blink of an eye, flowing from Julian's accounts into the Bratva's accounts with that damning message attached. The confirmation flashed across all 3 screens simultaneously. Transaction complete. Lashanda let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Seo-jin's lips were still against her neck, and she felt him smile against her skin. You just signed his death warrant without lifting a finger, he murmured. The Russians will find him within 48 hours. They'll make sure everyone knows what happens to thieves who mock them. And no one, not the police, not the FBI, not even Julian's father will be able to save him. Good, Lashanda said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Seo-jin straightened, his hands sliding away from her, and she immediately missed the contact. He walked around the desk to face her, his wet shirt still clinging to him, his dark eyes burning with something that made her feel consumed. Welcome to my world, Lashanda Smith, he said softly. I think you're going to fit perfectly. She stood, the silk robe falling open slightly, and met his gaze with all the confidence of a woman who'd just orchestrated the perfect revenge. I think you're right. Julian Vane's hands shook as he refreshed his banking app for the 14th time in 3 minutes. Still zero. The safe house was supposed to be untraceable, a converted loft in Gary, Indiana that he'd rented under a shell company 2 years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. Bare walls, burner furniture, windows facing a warehouse district where no one asked questions. He'd made it here in under 4 hours, driving a car he'd bought cash off Craigslist, leaving his phone and life behind. But he'd brought his laptop, and that had been his first mistake. The transfer had executed at 11:47 p.m. He'd watched $40 million, his entire carefully constructed escape fund, vanish from his accounts. At first, he'd thought it was a bank error, some glitch. Then he'd traced the transaction, the Bratva. His blood had gone cold, and then his burner phone had started ringing. Numbers he didn't recognize, all with Russian area codes. He hadn't answered the first 3 calls, but they kept coming, every few minutes, relentless. On the 4th call, he'd made his second mistake. He'd answered. Mr. Vane. The voice had been pleasant, almost friendly, accented but clear. We received your very generous payment. $40 million. With such an interesting message attached, Julian had tried to speak, to explain, but his throat had closed up. With interest. Don't come looking for me, the voice had continued, amused. That is what you said, yes? Very bold. We appreciate bold men. We would like to meet you, to discuss this gift. And the $6 million you borrowed before. The call had ended. That had been 20 minutes ago. Now Julian sat in the dark loft, staring at his laptop screen, trying to understand what had happened. The transfer hadn't come from his commands. Someone had hijacked his accounts. Someone with access to his security protocols, his biometric data, his Lashanda. The realization hit him like ice water. That bitch. She'd survived. The door exploded inward. Not kicked in, that would have been crude. This was precise. One of Seo Jin's men stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Julian's car. He had the calm, controlled presence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Mr. Vane, the man said in perfect English. My name is Dante. Mr. Hahn would like to see you. Julian scrambled backward off the couch. I have rights you can't. Dante crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed Julian by the throat, not choking him, just holding him, making a point about who was in control. The Russians are downstairs, Mr. Vane, in the parking lot, with very specific instructions about what parts of you they want returned to their boss. Would you like to meet them now? Or would you prefer to see Mr. Hahn first? Julian stopped struggling. Smart, Dante said, and dragged him toward the door. The drive back to Chicago was silent except for Julian's ragged breathing. They didn't blindfold him, didn't tie him up. Because what was the point? Where could he run that Seo Jin's reach wouldn't find him? Where could he hide that the Russians wouldn't eventually look? The elevator to the penthouse was glass-walled, showing the city dropping away below them as they rose. Julian's legs wouldn't stop shaking. His mind raced through possibilities, negotiations, explanations. He could offer information. He could. The elevator doors opened, and there, sitting on a cream-colored sofa in the center of the massive living space, was Lashanda Smith. She looked immaculate, dressed in dark slacks and a silk blouse the color of wine, her natural hair styled elegantly, her makeup subtle and perfect. She held a porcelain cup of tea in both hands, steam rising delicately. She looked like she belonged in a boardroom, like she owned the world. Nothing like the broken woman Julian had left bleeding on the gym floor. Dante shoved him forward, and Julian stumbled, fell to his knees in front of her. Miss Smith, Dante said politely, like he was delivering a package, as requested. Thank you, Dante. Her voice was calm, pleasant even. She took a sip of tea. You can wait by the elevator. Julian looked up at her, and the hatred in his chest warred with a fear so profound it made him nauseous. You can't do this. My father is on the board. Your father, Lashanda interrupted softly, received his termination notice 3 hours ago, along with evidence of his complicity in your schemes. He's currently being interviewed by the SEC. I don't think he's in a position to help you. She set her teacup down and leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes. How are your ribs, Julian? Mine are healing nicely. Thank you for asking. I'll give you anything. The words tumbled out desperately. Money, information, whatever you want. You have nothing. Lashanda's smile was serene and terrifying. I gave your money to the Russians, all $40 million, as compensation for the $6 million you stole from them. They weren't very appreciative of your message, by the way. Something about disrespect. Movement to her left caught Julian's eye. Han Seo Jin emerged from another room, and the sight of him made Julian's bowels turn to water. The dragon looked calm, hands in his pockets, but there was something in his eyes that promised violence. Seo Jin walked to Lashanda, stood beside her like a guardian, and pulled out a phone. He held it out to Julian. "They'd like to speak with you," Seo-jin said quietly. Julian's hand trembled as he took the phone. Put it to his ear. "Mr. Vane," the pleasant voice from before. "We are waiting for you in the lobby. We have a car. We will discuss your debt. Please do not keep us waiting." The line went dead. Julian looked at Lashanda, then at Seo-jin, then at Dante by the elevator. "You can't just... You're going to let them." "Let them?" Lashanda stood, and somehow that was worse than if she'd remained seated. She walked to him, and Julian flinched as she leaned down, her face close to his. "I'm not letting them do anything, Julian. I'm giving you to them. There's a difference." She straightened, nodded to Dante. "Wait." Julian scrambled to his feet as Dante approached. "Please, I'm sorry for what I did. Just don't..." "You should have thought about that," Lashanda said, her voice soft and final. "Before you decided I was someone you could break." Dante grabbed Julian's arm, started dragging him toward the elevator. Julian fought, pleaded, screamed. His voice echoed through the penthouse, bouncing off the high ceilings, the windows, the cold, beautiful space. The elevator doors opened. Julian was shoved inside, and the last thing he saw before the doors closed was Lashanda Smith, standing beside Han Seo-jin, watching him with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just won a war. Then the doors shut. Silence returned to the penthouse. Lashanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Seo-jin's hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she agreed. And for the first time in 2 weeks, Lashanda felt like she could breathe. The silence after the elevator doors closed felt like a living thing, heavy and complete, like the world had stopped breathing. Lashanda stood there, still holding Seo-jin's hand, staring at the brushed steel doors that had swallowed Julian Vane whole. She'd won. She'd orchestrated his complete destruction without lifting anything heavier than a laptop. She'd turned his violence against him, weaponized his greed, and delivered him to a fate worse than anything she could have managed alone. She'd won. So why did her hands feel numb? The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight and her voice steady began to drain away. It left her hollow, shaking. Her leg, the one with the deep hematoma that was still healing, suddenly felt like it couldn't hold her weight. The phantom pain that she'd learned to ignore came rushing back, sharp and immediate. She swayed, and Seo-jin caught her, just like he had in the boardroom 2 weeks ago, when her body had finally given out after 5 days of holding everything together. His arms came around her, solid and sure, pulling her against his chest before her knees could fully buckle. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "You caught me." Lashanda's voice came out smaller than she intended, muffled against his shirt. "Every time. You always catch me." She felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath. Then he was lifting her, not like she was broken, but like she was precious, and carrying her away from the elevator, away from the ghost of Julian's screams, still echoing in her mind. He brought her to the massive windows overlooking Chicago, the city spread out below them like scattered diamonds. He set her down gently on the wide ledge by the window, his hands lingering on her waist. The glass was cold against her back. He stood between her legs, close enough that she could count his heartbeats. "Lashanda." His voice was rough, stripped of the usual control. "Look at me." She did. His dark eyes were blazing with something that made her breath catch. Not the cold calculation she'd seen when he ran his empire. Not the controlled fury when he discovered what Julian had done. This was something raw and unguarded, something that looked like fear and hope and hunger all at once. "For 18 months I watched you," he said quietly. "I watched you walk through my organization like you owned it. Watched you fix problems no one else could see. Watched you stand in rooms full of predators and make them listen. And I told myself I was just appreciating a valuable asset." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Then you fell, and I caught you, and I saw what they'd done to you, what I'd allowed to happen because I was too blind to see it. And I realized," his voice cracked slightly, "I realized that if I lost you, I would burn the entire world down to ashes and rule over nothing." Lashanda's heart hammered against her healing ribs. "Be mine," Seo-jin said, and it wasn't a command. It was a plea. "Not my employee, not my director of risk, my partner, my equal, the person who stands beside me when I rule, and the person who catches me when I fall. Seo-jin, I will never let you fall again," he said fiercely. "I will never let anyone hurt you. I will give you everything I am, everything I have, if you'll just..." Lashanda kissed him. She pulled him down by his collar and pressed her lips to his, swallowing whatever promise he was about to make. Because she didn't need more promises. She needed this. Needed him. Needed to feel something other than the hollow victory of revenge. He made a sound low in his throat, surprise, relief, hunger, and then he was kissing her back like he'd been waiting his whole life for permission. His hands framed her face, tilted her head to deepen the kiss, and Lashanda felt herself unraveling. All the control she'd maintained, all the armor she'd worn, everything that had kept her standing for 2 weeks, it all dissolved under the heat of his mouth. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, So-jin rested his forehead against hers. "Say yes," he whispered. "Yes," Lashanda breathed. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her again, slower this time, reverent. His lips traced down her jaw, her neck, finding the pulse point that betrayed how fast her heart was racing. His hands moved to her waist, then slid around to her back, pulling her closer to the edge of the window seat, closer to him. "I almost lost you," he murmured against her skin. "Before I even had you." Lashanda's fingers tangled in his hair, and she pulled him back up to meet her eyes. "You have me now." Something shifted in his expression, darker, more intense. He lifted her effortlessly, and she wrapped her legs around his waist as he carried her through the penthouse, not to the medical suite where she'd spent the last 2 weeks healing, to his bedroom. The space was all dark wood and dim lighting, the bed enormous and inviting. He set her down on the edge of it and knelt in front of her, his hands on her knees. "Tell me if anything hurts," he said, his voice low and serious. "Tell me if you need me to stop." "I don't want you to stop." Lashanda reached for the buttons of his shirt, her fingers steady despite the racing of her pulse. "I want you to make me forget everything except this." He helped her with his shirt, shrugging it off to reveal the lean muscle beneath, the dark ink of tattoos she'd glimpsed before but never really seen, dragons and flames and Korean characters that probably meant something significant. Chaos made art on his skin. When he reached for her blouse, his hands were gentle but deliberate. He undressed her like she was something sacred, his eyes tracking over every inch of exposed skin, the fading bruises, the healing wounds, the evidence of her survival. And everywhere his gaze touched, his lips followed. A kiss to her collarbone, her shoulder, the sensitive skin just below her ear. "Beautiful," he whispered against her skin. "So damn beautiful, and strong, and mine." "Yours," Lashanda agreed, and pulled him down onto the bed with her. They came together like fire, meeting gasoline, desperate and consuming and inevitable. His hands mapped every curve of her body with a reverence that made her feel worshipped. Her fingers traced the hard lines of his muscles, learning the geography of him. Where he'd been separate and controlled before, now he was everywhere, surrounding her, holding her, making her feel safe and desired and powerful all at once. And when they finally moved together, when the last barriers between them fell away, Lashanda understood that this wasn't just about wanting him. It was about choosing him, choosing this life, choosing to be the queen who stood beside the dragon and ruled with equal fire. Later, much later, they lay tangled together in the dark, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her like he'd never let go. "The line between boss and employee," Lashanda murmured sleepily, "is pretty much incinerated." She felt Seo-jin's quiet laugh rumble through his chest. "Good. I never wanted an employee anyway." His lips pressed to the top of her head. "I wanted you." Lashanda smiled and let herself drift off to sleep in the arms of the man who'd caught her when she fell, and who would now rule beside her as they burned their way through whatever came next. 1 month. That's how long it took for Lashanda's ribs to fully heal, for the bruises to fade from her skin, for the Chicago underworld to stop whispering about Julian Vane's spectacular disappearance. The official story was that he'd fled to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. The unofficial story, the one that mattered, was that the Russians had found him in a hotel in Gary, and what they'd done to him would keep lesser men awake at night for years. Lashanda didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Tonight was the Han Group annual gala, the event of the season where Chicago's elite mingled with the dangerous, where business deals were made over champagne and threats were delivered with smiles. The kind of party where everyone knew what the Han Group really was, but no one dared say it out loud. And Lashanda Smith was making her debut. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in Seo-jin's bedroom, their bedroom now studying her reflection. The dress was midnight blue silk, form-fitting with a high slit that showed her leg when she moved. But it was the neckline that mattered. A deep V that exposed her collarbones, her shoulders, and most importantly, the faint scar where Julian's fist had split the skin. She'd chosen this dress deliberately. No more hiding. No more turtlenecks. Let them see what she'd survived. Let them understand what it meant to stand beside the dragon. "You're terrifying," So-jin said from the doorway. Lashanda met his eyes in the mirror. He was in a black suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like a weapon. His hair was styled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face. He looked every inch the CEO, the dragon, the man who controlled an empire with a whisper. But when he looked at her, his eyes held something softer, something only she got to see. "Good," she said, turning to face him. "I want them terrified." He crossed the room and offered his arm. "Then let's go remind Chicago who really runs this city." The drive to the gala was quiet. Not uncomfortable, but charged. Lashanda could feel the weight of what they were about to do. For the past month, she'd been hidden away, healing, strategizing, consolidating power behind the scenes. But tonight she was stepping into the light. Tonight she was claiming her place. As their car pulled up to the entrance of the Chicago History Museum, transformed for the evening into a glittering palace of power, Lashanda saw the press lined up behind velvet ropes, cameras, reporters, the board members arriving in their separate cars, their faces carefully neutral. "Last chance to change your mind," So-jin said quietly, his hand finding hers. "Not a chance." Lashanda squeezed his hand. "Let's give them a show." The car door opened. So-jin stepped out first, and the cameras immediately swung toward him. Then he turned, extended his hand back into the car, and helped Lashanda out. The flash of cameras was blinding, but more than that, it was the silence. The sudden, shocked, quiet as Chicago's elite registered what they were seeing. Han So-jin, the dragon who never brought dates to public events, who never showed weakness, who never claimed anyone, was walking into his own gala with his hand possessively on Lashanda Smith's back. They walked through the entrance together, and Lashanda felt every eye in the room track their movement. The ballroom was spectacular, all crystal chandeliers and ice sculptures and carefully arranged power players. The Han Group board members clustered near the bar, their expressions ranging from confused to hostile. Rival organization heads stood in corners, watching with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up new competition. And they were all staring at her. So-jin's hand never left her back. That small, possessive touch that announced to everyone present, "She is mine. She is under my protection. Touch her and die." They made their way to the center of the room, and Lashanda could hear the whispers starting. "Who is she? Where has she been? Isn't that the director of Risk? Did something happen to Julian Vane?" The orchestra finished their piece, and in the brief silence that followed, So-jin signaled to someone. A microphone was brought to him. He didn't step away from Lashanda. Instead, he kept one hand at her waist as he addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight." His voice carried effortlessly across the space, commanding immediate silence. "As many of you know, the Han Group has undergone some structural changes in recent months. Julian Vane has departed the company to pursue other opportunities." The way he said "departed" made several people shift uncomfortably. In his absence, and in recognition of exceptional service to this organization, all Han Group operations, both domestic and international, are now under the direct command of Lashanda Smith. The room erupted in barely contained shock. Lashanda kept her expression serene, but inside, her heart was racing. So-jin's hand tightened on her waist, a silent reassurance, and he continued, "Miss Smith has my complete confidence and trust. She speaks with my authority. Her decisions are my decisions." He paused, and his voice dropped to something darker, more dangerous. "Disrespect her, and you disrespect me. I trust everyone here understands what that means." It was a threat and a coronation all at once. He handed her the microphone. Lashanda took it with steady hands and met the eyes of the board members who'd watched Julian harass her for months, the rivals who'd assumed she was just another employee, the power players who were now recalculating everything they thought they knew about the Han Group's hierarchy. "Thank you, Mr. Han," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I look forward to working with all of you in the coming months. I promise to bring the same level of dedication to operations that I brought to risk management." She smiled, and it was all teeth. "I'm very good at identifying threats and neutralizing them." The message was received. She could see it in their faces. So-jin took the microphone back, handed it off, and led Lashanda toward the dance floor. As they moved, the crowd parted for them like water around stone. They were halfway across the ballroom when a man stepped into their path. He was older, maybe 60, with steel gray hair and a suit that screamed old money. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, and Lashanda recognized him immediately from the intelligence briefings she'd compiled for Seo Jin. Viktor Konstantin, head of the Russian Bratva's Chicago operations, the man whose money Julian had stolen, the man whose organization had delivered Julian Vane's fate. Victor looked at Seo Jin, then his gaze shifted to Lashanda, and he bowed. Not a casual nod, a full, respectful bow that made everyone watching go absolutely still. "Miss Smith," Victor said in his accented English, "it is an honor. You have done impressive work." Lashanda inclined her head gracefully. "Mr. Constantine, thank you for your cooperation in recent matters." His smile was knowing. Cooperation. Yes, that is good word. He straightened. "If you ever need such cooperation again, you call me directly." "Not him," he gestured to Seo Jin. "You." It was an acknowledgement. A recognition. She wasn't just the dragon's woman. She was a power in her own right. "I'll keep that in mind," Lashanda said smoothly. Victor bowed again and melted back into the crowd. Seo Jin leaned down, his lips close to her ear. "You know what just happened?" "He recognized me as an equal," Lashanda whispered back. "No." Sojin's hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer as they finally reached the dance floor. "He recognized you as the power behind the throne. Welcome to the game, Empress." As they began to dance, Chicago's most dangerous people watching them with new understanding, Lashanda realized that everything had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was ruling. The balcony was accessible through a side door that most guests would never find, but Seo Jin knew every hidden corner of the museum, every escape route, every place where power players went to breathe when the weight of their masks became too heavy. He guided Lashanda through the crowd with practiced ease, his hand never leaving the small of her back, until they stepped out into the cold November air. The noise of the gala faded to a muted hum behind the heavy door. Chicago spread out before them, all glittering lights and dark shadows, a city that looked peaceful from this height, but thrummed with danger at street level. Lashanda took a sip of her champagne, the bubbles sharp and bright on her tongue. She'd spent the last hour being introduced to people who either feared her or wanted to use her, and she'd smiled through all of it. But out here, with just Seo Jin and the city they now controlled together, she could let the mask slip. "You did well tonight," Seo Jin said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "I had a good teacher." She glanced at him, this man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word. "Though I think Viktor Konstantin bowing to me might have caused a few heart attacks in there." "Good, let them be afraid." His expression was unreadable as he stared out at the skyline. "Fear keeps them in line." Lashanda recognized that tone. Something was bothering him. She set down her champagne glass and turned to face him fully. "What is it?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he sighed, and it was a sound that carried the weight of empires. "The Russians are happy today," he said slowly. "We gave them justice for Julian's theft. We showed them respect. But tomorrow, next week, next month, they will remember we have power. And power in this world is currency. They will test us, try to take what we have. The Italians, the Irish, the cartels, they're all watching now, wondering if the Han Group is vulnerable with new leadership, wondering if you're a weakness they can exploit." He turned to look at her, and his eyes held a darkness she recognized. Not threat, but warning. "This life, Lashanda, it is a war without end. There will always be another Julian, another threat, another battle. You've seen what we do, what I do, what we're capable of." He reached out, cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything he'd just said. "You can still walk away. I have enough money to set you up anywhere in the world. Europe, Asia, somewhere they'll never find you. You could have a normal life. Safety, peace." Lashanda stared at him, and something in her chest cracked open, not with pain, but with understanding. He was giving her an out. After everything, after she'd proven herself, after Viktor Konstantin had bowed to her, after she'd been coronated in front of Chicago's elite, Seo Jin was still offering her a way to escape, because he loved her enough to let her go. She started to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, but grew into something fuller, richer. Seo Jin's expression shifted from serious to confused, and that made her laugh harder. "Did I say something amusing?" he asked, almost defensive. "You did." Lashanda pulled out her phone, the same one that had once held the dead man's switch that could have destroyed the Han Group. "You offered me peace, safety, a normal life." She pulled up an app and turned the screen toward him. "I deleted the old switch, Jin. The one that would have sent your files to the FBI. His eyes narrowed. When? 3 weeks ago. Right after She paused, smiled. Right after things changed between us. Because I didn't need insurance against you anymore. That was foolish, he said. But there was something soft in his voice. Maybe, but I made a new one. She tapped the screen, showing him the interface she'd coded. This one isn't about protecting myself from you. It's about protecting us from everyone else. Seo-jin took the phone, studying the display. His expression shifted as he understood what he was seeing. You linked it to my heartbeat. And mine, Lashanda confirmed. Biometric monitoring through our smartwatches. If either of our heart rates flatline, if either of us is killed, the system triggers. Every piece of intelligence we have on every rival organization, every dirty secret, every compromise, it all gets released. To the feds, to the press, to their competitors. Mutually assured destruction. She moved closer to him, took the phone back, slipped it into her clutch. You die, I burn the city down in your name. I die, you burn it down in mine. We're insurance for each other now, Jin. We're each other's dead man's switch. She looked up at him, this dangerous man who'd caught her when she fell and then helped her rise higher than she'd ever imagined. So, no, I'm not taking your money and running to Europe. I'm not leaving this war, because I finally found the only person worth fighting beside. Seo-jin stared at her for a long moment. And then something happened that Lashanda had never seen before. He smiled. Not the cold, calculated expression he used in board meetings, not the dangerous smirk he wore when making threats. This was genuine, warm, and real, and utterly devastating in its rarity. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, lighter, like the weight of his empire had lifted just for this moment. Mutually assured destruction, he repeated, and his voice was thick with something that might have been relief or joy or love. That's your idea of commitment? I'm a director of risk, Lashanda said, grinning back at him. I deal in insurance policies. He pulled her close, one hand threading through her hair, the other wrapping around her waist. You are magnificent and terrifying and absolutely perfect. I learned from the best, she whispered against his lips. He kissed her then, deep and slow and claiming, and Lashanda felt it in her bones this was forever. Not the safe, peaceful forever of normal couples, but the dangerous, thrilling forever of two people who'd chosen each other and chosen this life with full knowledge of what it meant. When they finally broke apart, Seo-jin took her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with old-world gallantry. Then let us reign, Empress, he said softly. Together. Together, Lashanda agreed. They stood there on the balcony, overlooking the city that was now theirs to protect and rule and occasionally burn when necessary. Two monsters in love, two survivors who'd turned their scars into crowns, two warriors ready for whatever came next. The war would never end. There would always be another threat, another battle, another test of their power. But Lashanda had stopped being afraid of war the moment Julian Vane taught her what it meant to fight for survival. Now she wasn't just surviving, she was conquering. Behind them, the gala continued. Board members made deals. Rival organizations sized each other up. The dangerous and elite of Chicago danced their careful dances of power and influence. But out on the balcony, with the cold wind whipping around them and the city lights reflecting in their eyes, Han Seo-jin and Lashanda Smith stood as equals. The dragon and his empress, partners in empire, mutually assured destruction in human form, and they were ready for anything. The greatest power comes not from ruling alone, but from finding someone strong enough to stand beside you and terrifying enough to destroy the world if you fall. If you loved watching Lashanda transform from victim to empress, and seeing Seo-jin find his equal in the most unexpected place, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which moment had you holding your breath. Because in a world of monsters, sometimes the greatest love story is finding someone just as dangerous as you are. Until next time, remember, the strongest crowns are forged in fire, and the best partnerships are built on mutually assured destruction. See you in the next story.